Hi, everybody. I'm Eric Wallace, here from Western Oregon University. I wanted to keep this more of like a casual, open forum. I've done more formal lectures on similar topics with PowerPoints in the past, but I wanted this more of a discussion. So it's not entirely me talking to you guys, but feedback. Get your guys' opinions on some of the topics we're going to be talking about. So we can all learn together. That's the gist of this. So a little bit about myself and how I kind of got into talking about performance disorders and musicians' dystonia and retraining people, myself, retraining people with performance disorders, is that I had one. The one I had is commonly called Valsalva maneuver, even though I've given a whole lecture on how problematic that name is for the disorder, but it's what's most recognized. It's this one. Right, so what's happening is I'm breathing in a natural process, and there's a slight hitch between inhaling and exhaling that's preventing me from just blowing normally. It ends up causing a locking sensation in the chest, sometimes in the throat. That causes a kind of explosive stutter sound, right? So the air is just kind of bursting out. It has been called in some journals stutter tongue or musical stuttering for just that reason. It kind of has a similar sound to speech stuttering. I developed it in my undergrad. I transferred to Cal State Northridge, and it just kind of happened and continued to happen, and I ended up struggling with it for about 4.5 years, almost 5 years. And while living in LA, I studied with everybody I could. And everyone had a little, like a tidbit or like what they thought would be a fix, and it would work for a day, a couple weeks. Some of those longer ones, I'd be like, oh, it's gone. I got this. That was the fix. But it always kind of came back because the basis wasn't quite able to be, I'm not going to say, I was going to say it's not pedagogical, but it is in a way. I had it for about 2 years, thinking I was just this loser who couldn't figure out how to start notes normally. That it was just, everyone was telling me, Eric, you sound great, you just have to work on your entrances. And I was like, okay, good, thanks. But it's a neurological thing preventing me from doing it. And I remember about 2 years in, I read an excerpt from Song and Wind on Doug Yo's website. And it was like sun bursting through the clouds, right? 2 years of thinking it's just me and being completely alone, thinking I just can't figure this out, and then finding out there's a term and a word, and other people have had this. And that was so important for me. So after I graduated, I took some time off to try to figure it out myself. I couldn't, right? So I went to, because I was looking up teachers that studied with Arnold Jacobs. I found Jan Kegerai, saw that she does retraining. I was like, great, perfect. Ended up getting in. I was lucky enough to study with Jan at UNT, and I'd had it for about 5 years at this point. Within my first semester, it was mostly gone. I remember starting the winter break and being able to, for the most part, play naturally. It took about another year from there to be 100% symptom-free, and I've remained so to this day. But, it really got me thinking. I had it for 5 years. I studied with everybody that would take my money or would let me get a lesson for like housework. And none of it worked for longer than maybe a few weeks. And then within a year with Jan, it's pretty much gone, right? Like, why is this so effective? And why am I only hearing of this from Jan? So I joined the Texas Center for Performing Arts Health, became a researcher, right? So kind of divided my time between research and trombone. And from there, just started researching what Jan was talking about with focus of attention. I did my dissertation. It was an epidemiological investigation of musicians' dystonia, and I argued in my dissertation that what I had, the locking hesitation disorder, is a form of musicians' dystonia, and I still believe that is true. And I think it's very similar to the yips in golf. You can watch old videos about that. I'm not going to go into that any further. And now I do retraining. I do this. I think I'd like to kind of stay vocal on this topic for a couple different reasons, right? Spreading the good word about musicians' disorders, how to retrain. But also I think it's really important for people currently struggling with it to know that they're not alone, right? It took me 2 years to find out I wasn't 100% alone. It took me another year. I had it for 3 years before I told anyone about it. First person I told after 3 years was Mike Fellinger, former bass bone for San Diego Symphony. And I remember the thing I was most nervous about is like, I got to tell someone. I got to tell someone. I told Mike Fellinger, and he was just like, oh, yeah, I got it. And he started listing all these big name players that I knew about who also had it. Like, this guy's had it for 20 years, right? And I was like, holy crap. But I still don't want to talk about it because, still, even at the time, before I started researching, I still thought it was a weakness. It was just, I haven't figured it out yet, right? I haven't found that one little pedagogical thing, what to do with my tongue or my breathing, that'll really kind of free me from this. So I still never wanted to talk about it until I went to UNT, and then half people in the studio have similar issues. We're all talking about it, right? It was so important for me to get that. And that's part of the reason why I do these lectures and these talks. So people currently suffering, future people who might stumble upon my stuff that have it, know they're not alone. That there's a fairly large percent of the musical population, right? 1 to 2% of all musicians, which is compared to non-musician populations, it's something like 0.00025% of the population, right? So as far as percentages of a population, musicians who have some form of performance disorder or dystonia is enormous, right? So, at this conference, statistically, there's 500 people, right? There's a couple dozen that have some form of this disorder or a disorder, right? I can talk later about what dystonia actually is beyond just the kind of basic definition that you're likely to find if you look it up. I'm going to tend to just keep steamrolling conversations, but if anyone has any questions at any point, throw your hand up and we can kind of redirect the conversation. Let's do it. Let's talk about what dystonia actually is. If you Google musicians dystonia, right, you're going to find out it's a task-specific focal dystonia. It is a neurological muscular disorder that causes involuntary muscle co-contractions, right? So what that is, co-contractions is when there's two competing muscle groups triggering to perform the same activity, right? My basic kind of description is we have, if you wanted to, the arm muscle's right here, right? You flex your bicep, and your forearm gets pulled towards you. You flex your tricep, your forearm gets pushed away. A form of dystonia would be what's called an agonistic-antagonistic co-contraction, where they're both flexing at the same time. And so those muscle groups are competing against each other, right? So if I wanted to pull my arm back, but the tricep wouldn't chill out, right? I wouldn't be able to normally pull it back. You get shaking, you get cramping, you get tremors. Right, and so that's the basic definition of it. You're going to play, right? I'm going to go blow air through the trombone. but suddenly I get a locking up here, or there's just something in the brain that's preventing me from being able to do that, right? Or you're going to blow air through and play a tone, and you get some muscle here or some nerve that starts tremoring. So I think we like to think of dystonia as a thing. Dystonia is this, but it's not. It is a spectrum of motor dysfunctions, right? It is not just a thing you get, it is a small thing that can kind of disrupt your playing, that can worsen over time until it becomes habitualized. So let's build a scenario. Let's say you got a new mouthpiece, or you got a new teacher who's telling you something, and suddenly you're getting just this little twitch when you go to, like, let's say slur up, right? F to B flat, there's this little hitch, a little thing that prevents you from being able to do that. It's specific to a scenario at first, right? It's when you're doing what your teacher says, or it's when you're playing on this new mouthpiece. New equipment, changes in feel are a big kind of precursor to developing these problems, right? And so over time, what do you do when you get this little hitch, right? I'm trying to slur from F to B flat. Something's happening in my chops. What's your natural instinct? Work it out, right? Let's see if I can get this twitch to not happening. So you start hyper-focusing on that twitch. And now it's happening B flat to D. And now it's happening every time you slur up. And then it's happening every time you slur down, right? And then eventually you hit this point where it's happening anytime you play. There's just this constant hitch whenever you're trying to articulate or just move around the instrument, right? You reach a point where this little hitch stops being dependent on this new thing, right? You got a new mouthpiece, you switch back to your old mouthpiece, and it follows you. You stop listening to the new teacher, right? Or the director that made you nervous, that kind of changed how you play. It stops happening in rehearsals, and it starts happening in the practice room. And it happens every time you're playing, and it's now no longer dependent on a specific situation. Now it's happening every time you play, right? We have now hit what's called dynamic stereotype level. This is the beginning of it becoming habitualized. And what I mean by that is it's now no longer, like I said, dependent on a scenario. It's all the time, regardless of everything else. It is now habitualized. We've started hitting the kind of disorder phase. And from there, it's a matter of degrees. Eckhart Altmuller came up with this kind of spectrum model and the term dynamic stereotypes, which is a reference to Pavlov, right? And eventually it hit dystonia. Dynamic stereotypes is just severity, intensity, and how difficult it is to get rid of it. And it is largely considered impossible to get rid of. A lot of scientists rely on, Botox, different kind of sensory feedback shifts, but we're starting to find more scientific evidence for how to retrain. But that's kind of a bigger picture of what dystonia is. It's not a thing, it's a little thing that happens to all of us. We've all kind of had those little playing things. The problem is some small percentage of us are just lucky enough that that little kind of playing thing that happened to us turns into a disorder. It is just the genetic makeup that makes us more susceptible to some playing disruption becoming habitualized and possibly losing your ability to play. Yay! So lucky. Any questions so far about dystonia?
What are some strategies that you can use for retraining? You talked about retraining, but what are some things you do to actually help people retrain?
Yeah. Cool. When we have dystonia, we've habitualized a dysfunction, right? So there's something we're doing when we play that prevents us from playing normally or naturally. So retraining is just stepping back as far as we have to find a similar task that you can perform normally and naturally. For my own retraining, it was being able to blow, no hitch, no locking up, no throat tightening, with just a mouthpiece being somewhere in the building. If there's a mouthpiece anywhere in the vicinity, couldn't do it, right? Even just a little bit. So it's just like, hey, mouthpiece. Great, right? And that probably took like 2 weeks. I was lucky, and before we keep going with this, I was lucky enough to be able to have an entire semester, my first semester at UNT. Jan kind of stepped in, hey, kept me out of large ensembles, kept me away from any intense rep, and I was pretty much able to just focus all my playing on retraining, right? So that gave me fall term or fall semester and winter break to just really focus on that. So that's why I was able to get it done quickly. I did have 2 weeks to just spend 3 to 6 hours a day with various kind of things. Most people aren't that lucky, and we can circle back to time commitment and how difficult it is to being a working musician and trying to retrain. Difficult, but not impossible. So, once I'm able to blow normally with a mouthpiece around me, it's, can I hold it, right? Now I'm feeling that mouthpiece. That changes everything, right? Just having the mouthpiece in your hand is different, right? Holding it and doing various kind of blowing strategies to be able to just blow air through. And eventually it's mouthpiece near, right? Mouthpiece on your face, right? Eventually you hit a point where you can hold your trombone and blow through the mouthpiece, right? Just those little baby steps into being able to blow a tone, right? And it takes a lot of time and effort just to get into that first tone. And from there, you can really begin expanding. Can I play a note? Can I play a note and move the slide? Can I start a different note? Yeah, so that's the basics, right? We're stepping back as far as we have to, moving as slow as we have to, being okay with stepping backwards a step, right? Because that's the main thing. Like you reach a point where I can do it, and then suddenly you can't do that thing anymore. And you might have to step back to the previous step. You might have to start right back over, right? But, I mean, especially if you've had this problem for me, it was 5 years. For some people, they've been living with it for decades, right? Your brain wants to go back to the thing it's been used to for so long. So you might have to start over a few times. But light at the end of the tunnel is normal function, being able to have fun on the instrument again. That's the thing. That's the thing you lose with a disorder. Having fun, right? No matter what you're playing, there's that little thing in the back of your mind telling you something bad is going to happen. Right, so that's why you put up with it. Okay, sorry.
You actually kind of went into my question. I was going to say, what's the place that you knew whether or not you had to go back a step in order to go forward? Like, it sounds to me like it's a very, an exercise of patience and acceptance and grace. But I know a lot of people in our industry are quite impatient with wanting to get better and be better and do better. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, great. I think a lot of people are looking for something that they can fit into their normal way of playing, right? And that's all the little fixes I got before I studied with Jan, right? You can do this also on top of what you're also doing, and then it'll improve. And it's not. Retraining is completely rewiring how you play the instrument, right? Generalization, right? But that's the idea. We're completely changing it, right? So at some point in the retraining, some old habit's going to kick back in some degree. And all it takes is that little bit, and suddenly, I was able to. And now, for some reason, I was able to do that Monday. Tuesday, it's back to. what the hell, man? I just got this, right? You got to be okay with that. That's learning. We all know progress doesn't go like this, right? If your student was like, oh, I can't play this week, you'd be like, yeah, dummy, it doesn't go like this, it goes like this, right? But I find that for a lot of us in retraining, once you have that first kind of hitch and that first kind of down point, it's like, it's back again, right? And so it's so important to keep reminding yourself, no, right? It's just a little dip. It's going to go back up. You just got to be persistent, you got to be patient, and you got to be forgiving. Right? It's going to happen. I had someone who came to me with it, and they weren't giving themselves that grace. We were retraining, and they had such a thick coat of depression around them. Right? They were just visibly sad about losing their ability to play. And we got to a point where they were able to do, at first it was, I can't play below this certain note. And I was like, we got to a point where they were able to play a full B flat major scale, starting in the range they couldn't play, all the way up, right? And every time we made that little bit of progress, the cloud, there'd be like hey, I could do it. And then like, but I can't do anything else, right? That cloud of like, but I still can't do it yet. Normally would come back, and eventually they just kind of gave up on themselves. So it is knowing that you're going to have bad days, you're going to have bad weeks maybe, but you just got to keep going at it. Yeah. By do you mean like for like me, right? Having recovered, how do I know if I'm not going to get a new thing? Or do you just mean, you're still in the process of retraining and you have that dip?
Yeah, maybe that wasn't the best way to phrase that question, but just like understanding if like what you're doing is correct and you might still have some down days versus if you're doing something wrong that would lead with not actually recovering but getting worse again.
Time, experience, right? I would think that if you're starting at step 0 and you get up to step 3, right? And now step 3's bad. It's going back to step 2, right? Going back to maybe step 1. Yeah, just if you're sticking with it and it's still continuing, right? You just got to go all the way back. And I do that in retraining, right? Sometimes you have to completely start over. And, usually it's kind of a quicker movement through the steps the second time, and then the third time, and the fourth time, right? And you're able to advance beyond that point. But I think it's just time and experience, whoever you're working with, whether or not you do need to start over or just go back one step. I think that answered your question. Anything else?
What do you find it's like the range of issues, physiological or whatever, like maybe don't have a twitch, but you've got some problem with the air, or like is it a lot of things, or they kind of all boil down into a couple, 2 or 3?
It is kind of variations. Embouchure dystonia, which is not quite my specialty. I've worked with people with embouchure dystonia, but having experience retraining, right, the blowing thing is what I think have the most experience retraining, right? And that one's a little bit more cut and dry, stopping breathing, although not quite. There's variations on where we're locking up within that and how it's forming. Embouchure dystonia is way more varied, right? You could spend all day looking up people's dystonia videos for any wind instrument, and there's a lot of differences in that. But one thing to keep in mind with all of this, right? If you're one of those lucky few susceptible to kind of performance disorders, you're just always gonna be. It is genetic, right? So I find a lot of people that come to me like for one specific thing, as we start kind of working, eventually it's like, oh yeah, I also have this, right? It's, I can't blow, we're getting them able to blow, now it's like, oh yeah, also my throat hurts when I play. Or also I get this little thing when I do something, right? Because it's how our brains like to process task execution that makes us more susceptible to having any little dysfunction become habitualized. So there are variations within embouchure dystonia as a form of dystonia and the hesitation problem I had, but those of us likely to get one are susceptible to many of them. Man, it sounds so dark. The more I talk about it, like, oh, the lucky few were likely to get it, right? But again, keep remembering, if you hear me talk about, like, you're the lucky few, you're going to get everything, it's always going to be bad. Keep remembering this spectrum, right? You start as a small thing and get worse. If you're finding that a problem you're having is becoming less situation or scenario dependent, right? You can move it right back down the spectrum. Find someone to help you do that.
Is it fair to say that peeling back to the airflow is a starting point for the multiple types of potential disorders that you're talking about?
Ooh. So like working on how to blow normally and naturally will also help you with how to do, things that would help with chop problems.
Chop problems, throat problems, any mobility, like the body has to move, right, when we breathe and blow. And it seems as though the starting solution is to peel back to the simplicity of the airflow and getting the body to work well.
Thank you, Gretchen. So great. How do we get dystonia, right? I talked about what it is, how it kind of worsens is the term, right? Because it starts as a small thing and it worsens over time, right? But what's kind of the pedagogical reason why this can crop up? And they're all linked, right? Pedagogically, problems that create Valsalva maneuver, right? And that cause, embouchure dystonia. It's what the literature calls reinvestment. Reinvestment is when you're reinvesting mental energy to producing a task that your brain already knows how to do, right? Everything we do in our lives is normal, natural, and thoughtless. Reinvesting is when you're putting more thoughts in how to do it into that task. So for instance, controlling the embouchure, controlling how you breathe, controlling tongue placement, all that stuff. Those are all things you do in other tasks without thought, without any sense of control, and you probably do them very well, right? When we go to put those similar tasks, blowing air, pursing our lips to blow out a candle, right? All these things that we do in different scenarios onto the trombone, now we're thinking about it differently. We're reinvesting mental steps and energy in performing it, and there's a conflict between those two things, right? Your brain says, here's how to do it. And you're saying, no, brain, do it this way. And the brain's not going to listen to you. The brain wants to keep doing it its own way. And so there's a clash. Another term for reinvesting is internal focus of attention, right? My attention is focused internally on the mechanics of working my body. And so the opposite, when you're retraining of that, is an external focus of attention, right? So instead of focusing on how I'm going to produce this task, right, I'm focusing on the outcome I want to achieve. And so in retraining, regardless of the problem, what we have to do is rewire that dysfunctional thinking of mechanics, that reinvestment, the internal focus of attention, rewire it to think as much as we can externally, right? So now for me, and with my retraining folks, right, I'm not thinking about how to breathe, like where the breath is going, how full breathe down, whatever, right? I'm just thinking of blowing air at whatever. There's just a constant shift of what the target is, right? A paper target, a pinwheel, a piece of paper, right? Some visual of like floating paper airplane across, right? But all of my blowing thoughts are on what I want to achieve and not on how to achieve it, right? And that mindset of how to execute a task is the same regardless of what the specific dysfunction is. It's identifying what the problem is, and then how far do we have to step back to be able to do it normally, right? For embouchure dystonia, can't play without that little twitch, right? Can you blow air through the mouthpiece without the twitch? No, you can't. Can we blow air through a tube, a plastic tube, without getting that twitch? We can. Great. Let's see if we can plug in something else that's similar to a mouthpiece into that tube and have you blow into it without that twitch, right? From there, you start progressing forward. So so we are completely rewiring how we think of performing the task. The hard part is when as is normal, right, you tell someone, think about this, and they go, yeah, okay, I'm thinking about that. And, they're not, because they spent from like 6th grade all the way up until this point thinking about X. They're not able to just think about Y all of a sudden because you told them to, right? There's always that little moment. I call it when horn hits face, right? I'm thinking external, 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 internal. As soon as horn hits face, everything kind of clicks over. And you have to just kind of fight against that change in thought. And I think a big part of fighting against that, right, that moment where the thoughts kind of flip back to the old way, train of thought, just got stuck in the station in the middle of that sentence, right? Is acceptance of bad sounds. Ooh, that's a big part, right? Being okay with going, that's fine, right? Because our goal wasn't to make a good sound, which is so hard to turn off, right? Our goal was to blow air through the horn without hesitation, without lockup, without thinking about the hows of the task, right? Ooh, that was great, right? Do you see how normally and naturally I did that, right? That's the hard part, because everyone wants a big, beautiful tone, and there's always that little bit of I want to sound good in the back of their mind. And keeping them focused, it's not sounding good right now. Can you blow normally? Can you do this without the problem occurring? And being able to accept sounding bad for the sake of retraining is super important and super hard to turn off because it's been ingrained in us since probably year 2. Year 1, everyone just wants you to make a sound, right? Once you hit advanced band in middle school, now suddenly it's all about sounding good. And it's hard to peel those layers back. I think that answered the aspects of the question. Yeah.
It sounds like to me.
Thank you, Gretchen. Because it's not just for retraining, the idea of an external focus of attention. It's not like, oh, you have a problem, now let's start thinking externally, right? There is no evidence on any task that supports an internal focus of attention, thinking of the mechanics, as being even equal to an external focus of attention with performing a task. Every task that it's been measured so many times, it's been measured with musicians, including a few wind instruments, French horn and clarinet, right? And across the board, everything from balancing boards, throwing something, jumping, more complex tasks, all the way up to piano trills, playing a wind instrument. Across the board, an external focus of attention improves execution, it improves musicality, it improves transferability of knowledge, so how easily you can transfer what you learned into a similar task, and it improves retention of that knowledge. So it is not a, this is what you do when you need to retrain. It is a, this helps every musician. And we all know it, right? This has been a thing since Arnold Jacobs' Song and Wind, right? It's the same concept, right? There is no embouchure, like Jacobs said, right? Blow a sufficient airstream, or just blow a airstream, who cares about sufficiency, right? Blow your ass off, hear very clearly what you want to perform, and it'll all turn out okay with time and experience. So, I'll get to you. Also, I'm realizing this is supposed to be like an open forum discussion, not quite a Q&A, and I just won't shut up. So I'll answer your question. We'll see if anyone else has any thoughts on efficiency, right? I'm sure there's a lot of people in the room that also work on, this is what I call efficiency, right? The idea of an external focus of attention and really making that how you play, it's efficient, right? Where we're cutting down everything that's unimportant and just working on blowing and hearing. That's efficiency. So I'm sure there's other people that have really good ways of how to teach that, not just me. So I'd love to hear from other people.
Well, the question I was going to ask might help pivot into a wider discussion. One of the most common things I see with students who come to me is velopharyngeal issues. They set up to blow and they get air leaking into their sinuses and through their nose, right, as they play. And I'm sort of curious, I know there are a lot of experienced teachers in the room. I found a few things that work for my students, and I'm wondering what strategies people use when they're working with students who have that air leakage issue, that stress velopharyngeal insufficiency.
Let's hear from the crowd. Has anyone experienced this, right? Anyone had students with it or played with it themselves?
Do you mean when there's kind of air leaking through the sides of your mouth, or?
No, there's the valve that separates your nasal passages from your throat, and you close that off when you blow through the mouthpiece, right? And so when that valve isn't sufficient to keep the air, to keep it sealed, and you blow, you feel, and you have that air leaking out of your nose when you play. That's what I'm talking about.
Like it tickles your nose?
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I've experienced that. I just thought it was like a one-off thing. It's only been like 2 or 3 times, but.
It happens for me when I get a cold. Like when I get a cold, things get inflamed, otherwise it goes away. But I've had 3 or 4 students who all actually have this every time they pick a horn. And it's really common for oboes and clarinets.
That's what I was going to say. It's
more common for women than it is for us. But.
double reeds is a big problem, right? Because there's just so much back pressure. But cool. Let's hear from other people. I want to learn too, guys.
Yeah, well, I won't say this is the answer, but I have had success with this with dealing with like airflow in terms of temperature, like cold versus hot. And it's 100% every time if I have a student use the hottest temperature of air, like the fogging up the mirror sort of thing. There's something about that that opens and relaxes in a way that prevents that clogging up. But they really have to know the difference, and they have to be able to blow the air in the horn the same way if they're not blowing the horn. You have to do a lot
Cool. So you're saying it's if we're going temperature hot versus cold, right? It's the cold air. When you're blowing cold air is when it's kind of happening, the nasal
For
leakage.
some people, because that's where sometimes people start squeezing or tensing or like trying to force something to play the trombone. And, you know, we've all learned over the years that less and less is the path to have a better sound. And when we start out
Yeah.
with that pinching, squeezing, constrained airflow, and we work to relax and let it be as easy and free as possible.
Cool. So kind of warming up the air. Cool. Yeah.
I would say, to add to that, if you go back even a farther step, sometimes it's because there's too much air that's being restricted in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And so, starting a sound or an airflow out without breath in can be another strategy.
Yeah, so I found a couple of things that work for my students. One thing that I thought would be, woodwind players always say, get rid of all the resistance. Like I talked to my clarinet colleague about it, and he said, oh yeah, I put them on the softest degree they can put them on the easiest blowing mouthpiece, and then we go from there. And I tried that with at least a couple of students, and it didn't really get anywhere. I talked to some other friends, and they suggested, well, have them blow into their mouthpiece and seal it off. So they're blowing against, blowing static air pressure against something. Because the problem with my students was they didn't sense it. They didn't know it was happening. And so by isolating just that sensation, they're like, oh, that's what you're talking about. And they were able to then figure out, oh, that's the muscle I flip to control it. So that's something that helps some of my students.
So when you're doing that, pretty much, eventually all the air will funnel out through their nose.
Well, you only do it for a second.
I see.
And then they would be able to feel, and they'd be able to feel that air leaking and be like, oh, that's the sensation that you're hearing in my, I'm sitting next to them in the studio and I hear this air leaking, but they don't sense it in their own way. It's something that's always been there for them. A lot of them, they started doing it when they were in fifth grade and no one's ever noticed it.
So having them experience like the extreme version so they could see that there's still...
Exactly, and then an experience to isolate just the sensation and they're like, oh, that's what it feels like, and they're just able to fix it, to figure it out.
Yeah. No, that's great.
Yeah, then one other thing I found helps is I've had at least one student whose problem was they were always trying to over-open in the back and that pulls that valve open. And so by having them like relax their oral, it was the opposite. They were trying to be too warm almost, and too open and too relaxed, and they were just stretching everything out. And so with that student, it was a matter of like, let's go the opposite direction, and that seemed to help.
Yeah.
In terms of like resistance, I've worked on a lot of my lessons with my teacher, and one of the best things that I found is using a variety of mutes, every kind of mute you can find, and just creating a scale between like the most resistance, like a really good practice mute, all the way down to a this little tool called burp, where it's like a mouthpiece holder, like the
Yep.
side, and just adds just enough resistance to where it's not like a free flow. But I found that helped me personally a lot with getting rid of that resistance. Because in my lessons, I didn't realize I was doing that kind of stuff and adding all that tension. That really, like, audibly and physically shows you how much resistance there really is.
It reminds me of, I think I got this from you, Gretchen, the full body tension and release, right? The student that keeps tensing up their shoulders or their chest or whatever, like, all right, let's sit down for 30 seconds and tense every muscle in your body. Now release it. Now play again. And like they go from like complete tension to complete relaxation, and then they can feel when that tension comes back. And like, oh, I am, yeah. Sounds like the same kind of thing, right? Yeah. Extreme pressure, like, oh, crap, you're right, there is. I find that the nose leaking, the solutions we're talking about and the problems are the same thing as throat pain. That's something I kind of get. My old Shires before I upgraded to my green hoe was like this giant tank, and I had to move so much air just to make a sound, right? And when I switched to my green hoe, I kept wanting to play it the same, but it's a much lighter horn. I started getting throat pain. It took me forever to figure out like why is it? Oh, it's because I'm still for everything like I needed to, right? So figuring that out and backing it down, right, kind of cures up the throat pain whenever it crops back up. Similar kind of cause and solution, I guess. Cool. Anything else? How about problems? Anyone want to play I didn't think anyone would, but I was hopeful. But like problems you see in your studio pretty often, problems you've had that you want to talk about or get feedback on.
Accuracy.
Accuracy?
Yes.
What kind of accuracy?
Just like playing something and having and replicating it like 5 times. That's something I've always struggled with, and I still do.
Having a very clear concept of what you want to do and trying to repeat the same kind of movements. How about concepts of how to produce it?
But then wouldn't that be an internal thought?
No, like I'm saying maintaining that very clear idea of what sound it is, right? Not just kind of pitch. I find a lot of times with students, like you're just hearing pitch.
Yeah.
You're not hearing tone, you're not hearing fronts of notes, you don't have that really clear concept of what you actually want it to sound like, right? And maintaining that as you're blowing air through the instrument every time. I'm talking too much. I want to hear from other people more. But for my master's recital, we had the dress rehearsal, and Jan was very unhappy. And she kind of threw out a passive comment about, like, if I let you continue with your recital. And I was like, holy crap. And I spent, this was like a week before the recital date, right? I'd worked up all my rep, and I remember, like, just panicking. She let us use her office, so it was always, like, an available practice space after hours. And I just went down and just started doing mental run-throughs. And I realized the sound in my head was my sound playing the piece. And it included those stupid mistakes. Like I keep flubbing this note, and I was running it in my head. I was like, holy shit, I'm hearing the flub when I play it because I've made that flub so many times when I've played it. It just became internalized. And so that week before my master's recital was like 3 hours a night, after hours, until like I couldn't stand it any longer. Mental run through, rewiring how I heard that piece in my head. And I did that so much. Recital was great. I was loose. So I was like, I know exactly what this is going to sound like. And I remember Jan came backstage expecting me to be like, oh, and I was like, hey, Jan, let's do this. And she's like, have you been drinking? I was like, no, I just feel prepared. And it was the first time I experienced having fun on stage, not just being nervous, but like, hey guys, let's make some music. And I'm still trying. I've been chasing that high ever since. Cool. Anything else you guys wanted to talk about?
To clarify, you were pretty much saying not having your sound in your head, but just like
the ideal concept.
Yeah.
Whatever that ideal is for you and for that specific piece or that section, right? Playing issues, inefficiencies, other questions in regards to developing retraining dystonia. We're pretty much out of time, but I'm happy to keep going until someone kicks us out. If anyone has anything else.
I was going to ask, would you recommend any resources that we can look at as teachers to help us, especially with dystonia retraining issues? Because there's not, from what I found, there's not a ton of literature necessarily that's easily available. Maybe on the internet, I don't know.
Well, I'm writing a book. David Vining. I mean, it's taking forever, but David Vining asked me to write a method book for retraining the specific thing I had that I kind of specialize in most, right? So like a Mountain Peak Press style retraining method book. So that's going to be a great resource if I ever finish writing it, right? But, there's I think just finding someone who can help you is the kind of the best thing. It's a very basic concept, really. It's just difficult in its execution. Think about what you want. Stop thinking about all the other stuff. Blow some air.
What would you say about early prevention if you notice something you suspect could evolve into a problem?
Awareness of the problem and trying to contact. I mean, it's same as, it's hard to fix things on your own. We're not good at seeing ourselves and what we're actually doing when we play. So having someone else who can kind of help identify that problem, I think, is very important. And just, if it's a problem, try journaling when it happens. I tell people, like, if you're getting a specific problem, journal when it happens, right? What was the scenario? What was happening in that day that kind of made it occur? And see if you can find patterns in the behavior, right? And it happens when I'm playing this kind of music, or I'm doing this technical thing, right? But it doesn't happen these other times, right? What is it about that style of playing, that piece, whatever that is, that's kind of causing it, right? Identifying when the issue happens, what specifically the issue is, will help you kind of tackle it yourself in a way, right? We're really identifying the basis, if that answered anything.
Like in addition, right, like I'd say in my experience, like it's been exactly that awareness, right? Like whether it's facilitated by, a peer or teacher, or if it's like, insane introspection. Like the second happens a lot less often, but like I think I had an aha moment while I was sitting here, right? I'm like, I get tense like every time in my core before like I can't make a pitch happen, right? Like if I airball it, right? Most of the time, like from my memory, right, I get really tense up here or like down here. And I'm like anxious to go into some practice room and go like experiment out.
Yeah, that's right. I went back to answering the questions. That was a good question. Anyone else have any advice, solutions? Sure.
I just want to add, you mentioned journaling, and I swear by journaling, because you think you understand like the kind of experience you're having in the moment, but once you are forced to put it into prose or to describe the experience you're having in a different way, you'll be surprised at what the experience was really like when you have to put it down on paper. That kind of helps create like a new perspective without having to like go up to someone and be like, hey, can you listen to me? Do I sound like crap? Like, so I love journaling for that.
Yeah, helps you really understand it. No,
Talking to people are like really similar in the sense that you're rewording it, you're recontextualizing it, like can really help people understand something like pull up that around.
And life in general too, not just journaling.
you know what? Let's call it, guys. We started at 4:30, right? We've been almost an hour. Unless there's anything else anyone wants to ask or talk about. Doesn't have to be a question for me. Otherwise, let's see ya.